One of the greatest tragedies, of course, of human life. And it's hard to believe that all these years on, movies later, etc., people are still fascinated by the ship that was the Titanic. The most glorious, glamorous vessel that had so many people clamoring to go on its maiden voyage. Of course, so many people were left out, but there were literally people that could have walked on there for free, including members of the British monarchy. You see, right at the start, White Star were desperate to get people literally associated with the brand. It's hard to imagine now that this was like modern day branding, you know. Who could we get on there? Who could we get to perform, cabaret, sing, magicians, all sorts of things. Everything was literally geared to making this the #1 sensation, the best way to travel across the ocean. But what was fascinating was there was a royal connection associated with the Titanic that not many people know about. As ever, let me explain. Morning, lovely to see you. Thank you so much for joining me today. Yes, the Titanic is a thing, isn't it, that we're all fascinated by. There's a wonderful museum, a replication of the interior, and even to this day, any new find or anything on an auction goes for thousands, millions of pounds as such over the years, and it's worth so many things, isn't it, when you think about it. What I also find interesting is the varying degrees of films that have been made. Now, my particular favourite, I have to be honest, chums, is the 1950s version starring Kenneth More and Honor Blackman, A Night to Remember. Brilliantly shot and brilliantly acted, and really gave a true depth of what a terrifying night it must have been when all of those poor people realised they were never going to return. Of course, we all know the stories as to what happened, the lack of lifeboats and stuff like that. And I don't know about you, but the more modern day version, starring Kate Winslet and Leonardo DiCaprio, while fabulous, you do kind of figure that, of course, this is more of a romanticised version. Unlike the 1958 version, I think they were very clear about the way they were portraying it. I don't know if you know this also, but the interior shots were actually shot at a very famous London hotel, the Waldorf, and that's because apparently the ballroom area almost replicated the same version as the Waldorf in London. So if you have afternoon tea there, you can truly imagine what it must have been like. But what is the royal connection? Well, it's fascinating when you think, because as you can imagine, King George V had now taken the throne. Sadly, of course, the passing of Edward VII. Now, they hadn't always got on to the best of their abilities. You see, King George was a little bit more about the people. I'm not saying Edward VII wasn't, but he liked being a personality, whereas King George had a more caring, sharing side and wanted to do the good for the working class people. Now, as many people know, the Titanic was all about glamour, glitz, and of course, the famous people that boarded it. But what King George was interested in was the people that were travelling on steerage, third class. You see, for him, he realised that a lot of people were going to quit Britain and go across the pond, as it were, to start a brand new life. And he was very concerned about how they would be treated literally on board, because obviously he knew the level of, stars, as it were, first class, second class, and then third class. So what happened was he was invited to peruse the menus, but he wasn't interested in the first class or the second class menus. He spoke with the head chef, Charles Proctor, who then went over to the Royal Palace to show him exactly the sort of things that he would be cooking for the passengers. And as you can see, they had a real mixed bag of stuff. But even though we consider this today to be like lower class, this was the very best of lower class, you know. And King George apparently wanted to make sure they were getting the right nutrients, was it fresh food, all of that sort of stuff. He didn't want them going over there malnourished. And that's the reason why when the head chef of the Titanic did send over all of the ingredients, all of the menus that they were planning to put together for that particular class, well, that's when King George decided, in fact, they were doing a good job. But they didn't give up White Star. What they thought was, well, now you've seen that, could we say that, you bless this sort of thing? You think it's marvellous the way we're even treating third class. Of course, they weren't allowed to do that because that would have been advertising. But what they really wanted to do was try and get anybody from the British monarchy on board. But sadly for the White Star Group, it didn't matter how much they tried, or indeed the sort of lures that they were offering them. Nobody was available. What they thought was, this is great, but consequently you have to think as well, this was a new launch. Nothing had ever been done like this before. What people realised was this was the biggest, most glamorous and glitziest liner of the age. But that really didn't lure the royal family. What concerned King George was how people were going to be treated. Not just, of course, the third class, but many of the people over here from the United Kingdom that had rushed to get jobs. And it's fascinating to think, isn't it, lost in those files, that's exactly what the royal family did behind the scenes. Sadly, of course, tragedy truly struck, and this hit King George and the Queen very hard. But clearly, there was nothing they could have done. The other side of the coin, though, is, as I often say here on the show, a lot of people don't realise the groundwork that the British monarchy do behind the scenes. There was no fanfare. This was never reported in the media. This was all done very quietly behind the scenes, making sure people were simply looked after. That's nice, right?